Proposition 1 Round 2 IRWM Implementation Grant Program Call for Projects Assistance Workshop. So for those of you who have not participated in an IRWM grant before, I will go through some of the background, kind of high-level explanation for what differentiates an IRWM grant from another similar state grant. But then the intention of this workshop today is to really get more into the detail of submitting a project during the call for projects for consideration of funding in this round. Go ahead, Andy. So this is just a quick check-in on virtual workshop etiquette. Again, please stay muted if you are not speaking. You should see next to, if you're joined via webinar, you should see the option to mute yourself with a little microphone on the side. If you are joining via phone, I believe it's *6 to mute and unmute yourself. And if you are joined via webinar, please use your raise hand feature. So as you can see there, the little icon with a very happy little person with their hand raised. Please use that button at the top of your screen should you like to ask us a question, so we can either pause or wait until a good stopping point to get to those questions. I would again just ask that everyone, if you are not speaking, to mute. If we do have a lot of background noise, I may mute your line, so just keep that in mind. If you do want to comment, check to see if you are muted or unmuted. Next slide. So in terms of welcome and introductions, I'll let the team introduce themselves. I'll kick off. But what we'd like for you to do, Andy, I think we have on the next slide a request for everyone to put into the chat their name and their organization, if applicable, so that we have a general sense for who's with us today. You are not required to do that, but it does help us better understand the interest level for the grant. So I will start. My name is Jenna Voss. I work for the County of Orange. I am the administrator for the South Orange County IRWM group, and I will pass it off to Andy McGuire.
Hey, sorry. Thanks, Jenna. Hi, I'm Andy McGuire, and I work for Orange County Public Works in the South Orange County Watershed Management area with Jenna. And then I will send it to our support team. We have Karen Ashby.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Karen Ashby with Larry Walker Associates, and I'm partnered with Avery Blackwell, and we are reviewing the project submittals when they come in and helping kind of vet them, make sure that they're submitted fully. And my focus is primarily on the eligibility requirements.
Yeah, hello, and I'm Avery Blackwell, GSN Tech Consultants, and my key role is to help vet the scoring of the projects to make sure that we have a good ranked list of projects based on the benefits that they're providing.
All right, and thank you. I see all of you are entering your name and affiliation to the chat box. Thank you so much. Next slide. So as I stated, I'll go through the high-level overview. And again, if you have questions throughout the presentation, this is intended to be an interactive workshop, so please do add your questions into the comments or raise your hand to be unmuted, and you can chime in. Next slide. So again, a good share of you have participated in the IRWM process in one form or fashion, whether you regularly participate in the meetings or you've submitted and have had funded a project in the past. However, I know that's not applicable to everyone. So just as a very high level overview, IRWM is different from other state grant-based programs. It is both a grant program, but it is also a state administered program for collaboration and multi-sector coordination on water resource management that is intended to supplement the grant program, but really focus on mutually beneficial solutions throughout watershed planning areas in addition to the grants. And the South Orange County IRWM group has been working together since effectively 2005. So we've had a long-standing program. We are in the San Diego funding area. I'll go into that in a second, but effectively the funds through Proposition 1, which was a voter-approved bond, have been disseminated across the state within those funding areas that you see identified on the screen. We are in Region 6, which is the San Diego subregion. We share the funding allocated to that subregion with 2 other accepted IRWM regions. So there are 48 accepted IRWM regions across the state. South Orange County group meets that. We are one of those 48. We have an accepted plan that establishes the priorities for projects. And in the IRWM grant program, those priorities are the drivers for which projects end up moving through the process as priorities for funding. Next slide. Again, this is a very locally driven process. That's the intention of IRWM. So our IRWM plan establishes measurable goals. These really represent the foundation of what we do in South Orange County to achieve, that multi-sector resiliency across water resource priorities. The goals are further clarified with quantifiable objectives and measurable strategies. We'll go into that in a second, but this is how effectively your project will be scored, ranked, and assessed. These have really, over time, the goals, objectives, and strategies become a very quantified exercise because we are really looking for multiple benefits in across our 4 primary goals. Andy, if you don't mind going to the next slide, which are protection of natural resources, water quality, surface water quality improvement, water supply reliability and efficiency, and flood risk management. So you'll see in the score sheet and in a lot of the questions that you'll be asked to complete as part of the project submittal form are really driven by not just the eligibility for the grant that's established at the state level, but these IRWM plan goals, objectives, and strategies that are determined and driven by local priorities. Next slide. For the South Orange County IRWM in this round of funding, as I mentioned, we are part of the San Diego subregion of funding. We were collectively allocated $52.5 million. This was over 2 rounds. There's a cutout for state administration, and then also a very specific carve out of $10.5 million for disadvantaged communities. That is an official designation. And we have more information about that included in the workshop today. We will highly encourage you that if you have more questions about that, that you reach out to us and the application team. South Orange County, as part of an agreement we have with our other 2 IRWM regions within our funding area, based on land area and population, has for this round about $3.2 million to allocate to projects. I would note that, again, there's a specific designation for disadvantaged communities in South Orange County that we have for this round about 1.27 million of that total to allocate to disadvantaged communities. Next slide. So this is this gives you a general sense for the review and selection process. Obviously, we've just kicked off the call for projects. That's that first step there. We have an allocation of new funding, so we now make available that the funding application process through what is called a call for projects. It is up to all of you now to submit and update your project forms and go through this quantification process and give us a good sense for what your project will provide in terms of benefits to South Orange County. There is then a clearly laid out review process that is central to the IRWM plan. And in this round of funding, DWR is very heavily deferring to that process. So we have a lot of individual and local autonomy that is driven by everyone participating in the process. So the first step is we do a very high level eligibility check. Projects that do not meet the baseline eligibility for DWR's requirements, sorry, the State Department of Water Resources, under Proposition 1, if they do not meet that threshold, we'll have an interaction with you to make sure that we're not missing something. But if there is a question about eligibility, projects may be filtered out at that point. Only eligible projects will go through the full vetting process. That process kicks off with an ad hoc committee of the management committee. So again, this goes back to the governance structure of our region. That's a subgroup of several representatives kind of spanning different water resource management roles and responsibilities. They focus on the quantifiable aspects of project review. And what's important about that is you will be filling out all of these metrics within the application process, and we will have an interaction with you if there are questions about those quantifications. So I'll go into this in a second, but we really want to make sure that you are prepared to engage at each step of this process. The full management committee then looks at the recommendations that come out of that quantifiable review through the ad hoc, and they make a recommendation. These recommendations ultimately all move forward to the elected body of our group. The stakeholders or interested parties also have a full vetting exercise. We'll have a workshop in approximately September where everyone who wants to participate gets a chance to go through all of the quantifiable assessments of the projects and the resultant rankings and make any modifications to a recommendation that they want the executive committee, our elected body, to see. They ultimately make the final call on recommending a slate of projects for funding. That slate of projects then goes through the application process and is submitted to DWR. Next slide. So this is in general, this is the schedule moving forward from here. The call for projects has been initiated this week, runs through July 1st. That is a hard stop on July 1st. So if you have any concerns about your project, any questions, we highly encourage you to engage early and often. The eligibility review that I mentioned kicks off thereafter. The full ad hoc review that really gets down into the nitty-gritty on the metrics will take place in August. The workshop I mentioned in September. Then it goes to the executive committee consideration on November 17th. This is a public meeting that if your project moves forward, you'll be expected to participate in, as with the public workshop in September. The application process is another key element here. The application is due February 1st to DWR, so please be aware that in between November 17th and February 1st, you will be expected to participate in the development of that application, which includes developing budgets, work plans, schedules associated with your project. Another note, completion of project permitting and execution of the agreements is separate. So once the application goes in, this is another just element of the process we wanted to make you aware of. It is likely that this process goes for you, if you are engaged in it, goes all the way through to the completion, which would be the end of 2027. Next slide. Any questions on the high-level process elements? Okay. Go ahead, Andy. Oh, Karen, I think this is yours.
Okay, got it. Thank you, Jenna. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and touch on the eligibility requirements. So you next slide. So DWR issues two key guidance documents that we use to evaluate the eligibility and to help answer some of the detailed questions that will come up. And that includes the grant program guidelines, which is the document on the left, as well as the proposal solicitation package document, the one that's on the lower right. And both of these documents have a lot of similar types of information between them. They're just at a little bit different levels of information that's provided. And they both contain the eligibility requirements that we go through, summarize, and then evaluate each of the projects against. There was a draft version that was submitted or that was out in December with the final version that came out in May. And I'll just note a couple of the key differences between those two versions of the documents. So on this slide, what we're going to go through for today and what we evaluate is the different types of eligibility criteria that they have. And this is all actually summarized in a Word document that looks like the version that you see on the right-hand part of the slide. And that is available for you to download. So you can take a look at the types of questions that you'll be asked when you submit your project. And it's meant to also help guide you so that you can collect that information beforehand, have it ready on hand so that when you go through the process of submitting your project, you'll have whatever information you need to be able to fully answer those questions. And it is a nice kind of one-stop shop, if you will, for all of the eligibility criteria that we'll be evaluating. So on the left-hand side of the slide is the list of what the different types of categories, if you will, for eligibility. And we're going to go through each one of these in the next few slides. The other thing at the very bottom there that I want to recognize is that in addition to looking at the pure DWR eligibility criteria, we also, Avery and I and ad hoc and others will look at project readiness. So that's where we also kind of take a step back and look at elements that will make a project successful and be able to complete within the time that's allowed by DWR. So that's another kind of level of evaluation that we conduct, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. Okay, so the next slide. So the very first one, actually, this one and the next criteria, they're pretty straightforward. It's just, are you eligible as an applicant to submit your project? And so there's these 6 categories, and I don't think we're going to have an issue with that. It's primarily, public agencies, utilities, nonprofits, et cetera. So yeah, so it's just a very straightforward assessment. And then next slide. The same is also true with the project types. There's a whole range of project types that are eligible to be submitted for consideration. And there's a huge list that's on this slide that you can evaluate. One thing that I just want to recognize between the draft and the final versions of the guidelines and PSP, decision support tools were always a part of the category types. Or the project types, but they provided a little bit more clarification as to what those types of support tools might include and the benefit that they need to have. So that is provided now in the PSP if you're curious and submitting that type of project. Okay, next slide. So really straightforward, right? It's kind of like enter your name and address, right? It's who you are as an applicant and your project type, really straightforward. The next level of eligibility that we take a look at is really at the proposal level. So that means the proposal refers to the slate of projects that's ultimately submitted. So if there's 4 projects, 6 projects, whatever the number is, at least one of those projects has to meet each of these 4 categories. So not all 4, but amongst the slate, one or more projects has to meet these 4 different types of criteria. And so for each of these, so for example, for climate change, one question will evaluate each of the projects and determine, does the project target strategies to address climate change impacts? Regional collaboration will look at projects and see if they're providing incentives for water agencies or promoting regional collaboration. Regarding water self-reliance, we'll take a look and see if the projects are contributing to regional water self-reliance or reducing dependency on the Sacramento Delta. And for contamination, where this has been identified as an issue, we look to see if the project addresses different types of contamination that has been identified. So again, this is at the proposal level. So what we'll do is we'll just simply note at the very beginning stages which projects meet this criteria, and then we'll reevaluate that once we have a good slate and we've gone through the scoring to make sure that we're still in balance with the criteria as well as the high ranking scores. Okay, the next slide. So that was the proposal level, and now the next set of criteria apply to every single project. So at a project level, we need to also make sure that all of the DWR eligibility criteria are met. And this includes this kind of list of I think 8 different categories. And again, some of these apply and some don't, depending on the type of project. One really important one is that the project must be completed by the end of December in 2027. So between the draft and final documents, they did extend that a year. So that I think was very helpful. But in noting the completion, something that you should be aware of is that what that really means is backing that out to more like a September timeframe, because completion is kind of like final paperwork, things being submitted. So it's really, it's good that they extended it, but I would really look at, it's not kind of last brick being laid December 31st. It's really more in that fall timeframe. And then there's some other kind of criteria regarding the fact that the project proponent, the agency that's submitting, they have to have adopted, which I think most people have. Oops, sorry, that slide's wrong. It would be the South Orange County IRWM. So strike that. And then also we have to address the water code preferences, statewide priorities that are identified in the guidelines. They have to address the critical needs of the region. And have a funding match. So the funding match is an interesting one because we really target to try to see if each project will hit that kind of 50% match. This is ultimately assessed at the proposal level, but it's a good guideline for each project. If it's a construction-based project, there has to be a demonstration that it will have a useful life of at least 15 years. Most of the time, that's not a problem. And then if there's a very specific stormwater project or groundwater project, there are some follow-up verifications that need to be made there. Okay, the next. So the next, what we're moving into is we've really kind of gone through everything that's specified in the DWR guidelines and PSP. But there's additional information that helps us as reviewers understand more about your project and assists us in kind of making this project readiness determination. Again, looking for projects that will be, successful for the grant. So the other criteria that we ask, the other information that we request for each of the project submittals includes the start date, where you're at currently with the design, the percent completion, and when that's going to be completed. It's really important to know what types of permits you might need and where you're at in the status of obtaining those permits, including environmental-based permitting like CEQA. We all know that these types of permits can take a really long time, and so we just need to make sure that the timeline works from the design, permitting, construction, all the different phases. So we'll take a look at all of those. And then also if there are project partners that the project will rely on, they're dependent upon in order to be able to be completed, we'll want to identify those project partners up front. And again, if there's any agreements that need to be made there, understand where that is in process. Okay, next slide. And lastly, this is also kind of in the additional information category. But we're also going to want to know up front and really early on if the project is either potentially going to be submitted as a disadvantaged community or economically distressed area, a DAC or EDA project. If a project is being submitted under kind of that DAC heading, it's really important that it meets the criteria, which means that 75% or more of the area has to directly benefit a disadvantaged community or EDA. And so we'll want to work with you right up front to understand how the determination is made, how you use the different mapping tools that DWR has, and the like, to make sure that the analysis is robust and will withstand the scrutiny that they'll give it with this category. The other thing, though, and I noted this with project versus benefit, on the flip side is you might have a project that has a benefit to a DAC or EDA, but maybe you're not going for kind of the DAC funding pot, which is also okay. But again, if you're claiming even a 25% benefit or likewise, and you're looking for some sort of cost share percentage reduction, we'll again also want to work with you very closely to understand, you know, how the DAC area was determined. So I think that the message there is there's a couple different ways that you can look at the DACs or EDAs, but we're going to want to work with you as early as possible so that we understand what supporting information you have and how the analysis was conducted. And make tweaks therein, or there's probably questions you might have, so we'll want to work with you closely. Okay, the next slide. So then I've been talking a lot about kind of the strict DWR criteria versus the other information that makes it really helpful for us in looking at kind of project readiness. So the types of things that we're going to be looking for, again, there's some overlap here, but like project start and completion dates, studies that we'll want to understand, you know, do you have studies that support the claimed benefits? Because that goes directly into kind of scoring and understanding the effect there. Understanding that the minimum threshold, there may be a minimum threshold for projects kind of around 500,000. So we'll want to take a look at what amount of money is being requested through the grant.
Hey, Karen.
Oh
just
yeah,
real
go ahead,
quick.
Jenna.
Sorry to intercede real quick. In the last round, we applied that because for implementation, you know, brick and mortar construction type projects, that typically has been used as a kind of a basement grant request. However, because decision support tools and there's such a significant allocation for disadvantaged community projects that do not require a match, this may change. So just keep that in mind that this is for those traditional brick and mortar construction type implementation projects.
Yeah, thank you, Jenna. Yeah, and that's why I did want to hedge it where we said kind of likely. Yeah, I appreciate that, Jenna, but the clarification is very helpful. And then we're also going to want to understand, in addition to the studies that you may have to support the claim benefits, also understanding the cost estimates. How recent are they? Are they potentially incomplete? Will we want additional information to make sure that they're fully supported? And this is really important when we start going through all the budgeting documents, et cetera. We'll also want to understand if the funding match, again, if the project is dependent upon a project partner or any sort of funding that, is that funding actually secured, or, are there additional steps that need to be had in order to get that funding? And then CEQA is not a project eligibility requirement, but it's important that it's completed within a certain time frame, again, to allow enough time for the project to be implemented. And so we've kind of targeted that February 2025. That's not a DWR specified time frame. That's a time frame that again, we've targeted to allow enough time for the project completion.
Karen, just real quick.
Yeah.
They did amend in the revised guidelines that for the execution of an agreement. So should your project move forward to the agreement phase, you will have to complete CEQA with any permitting required to start construction must be completed within 18 months of execution of the agreement, or your project will no longer be eligible. So it's not an eligibility requirement through necessarily the application process, but yeah, it would preclude your project from actually being in receipt of any funding if you were not able to meet that deadline.
Yeah, thank you, Jenna. Yeah, and so that's why we pulled that forward as a part of the project readiness, correct? Because yeah, it's in the grant agreement language. Okay, so that's an overview of, again, kind of both the DWR eligibility as well as the additional information that we're looking for to assist in our review. And I'll just pause there and see if there's any questions. Yeah, George.
Yeah, sorry if I may have missed it, but the minimum threshold of asking that 500,000, is that with a cost share? So asking 250,000, or a minimum asking of the grant of 500,000 with the cost share of 500,000?
So again, it's not a predetermined minimum. It's more for that would be with that's the ask, the grant request. So first, to answer your question, that's the grant request. So a project that's costs $1 million that requires a 50% match of 500. The reason we've done that in the past is that folks have indicated that for larger scale projects, anything, you know, $1 million or over, and receiving a grant that's anything less than half of that makes it really hard to administer the grant and make it worthwhile. That doesn't necessarily mean that it'll apply here. It's more meant to just give some guidance for why we've set that in the past, should that arise. But because decision support tools, there's a lot more information in this round, that does not really apply. They're unlikely to be that amount. There's also the opportunity to have those cost share waivers. So what I would encourage everyone to do is submit your project with whatever grant request you are making that fits with your project. So if it's still a worthwhile exercise for you to request that amount of funds, and it's 250K, that does not mean you are precluded. It's more the proportion. Does that make sense?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Looks like we have a question real quick or a comment from Moy. He doesn't have a microphone. Can you go over the SQL requirements again?
Yeah, Jenna, do you want me to do that?
I can if you want. So CEQA must be completed. We're approximating by about February 2025. The reason for that is that 18-month, that's kind of punting out 18 months from the expected execution date of an agreement. So just to take one quick step backward for everyone, the IRWM grant is administered through the County of Orange. We are the actual applicant because we do this on everyone's behalf. And then we have an agreement with you should your project move forward through the grant program. So that DWR agreement kind of sets the eligibility standard for once you are in the process. Your project has been selected and approved by DWR. They haven't inserted CEQA requirements at any stage before then, now in this round of funding. So it in effect is an eligibility requirement, because what they're doing in this round is if you don't meet that 18 months within execution of the agreement, you will not move forward. So the CEQA requirements are the same as any other, grading permit, anything else, an encouragement permit you may need in order to start construction. Does that help, Moy? Okay. Any other questions? Amir?
Yes, good morning. This is Amir El-Khani, Porcida San Clemente. Are you going to be providing more information regarding the deadline before July 1st as far as submittals? We have some questions, or we may call in at a later time to ask our questions directly, but can you please elaborate on that?
Are you asking if there's an interim deadline? Or sorry,
no, I just we started filling up the forms. We just got on this, last week or so, and we want to make sure we comply with all the requirements, and we're submitting before July 1st. But you basically have to fill up the forms and include all the information requested. I suppose as I said, we may need a little bit of help with some of the questions. So I believe we have to call in directly and get some help individually.
That option is always there for you. We are just about to go through actually walk through it for you. So
good.
Right after this, we'll kick it over to Andy and Avery, and they'll give more, they'll put finer points on what we've been discussing in terms of the application. So hopefully most of your answers, you'll get most of your answers.
Fantastic. That's what I was asking for. So I think it will be. Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yep. Sorry, we just have a lot to cover for this grant program. It's a little different from the other state grants.
Fantastic.
All right. I think then we're good. Andy, you can take it from here.
Thanks, Jenna. Yeah, so everyone, I'm going to walk you all through the project submittal process. Next slide here. So the project submittal form is located on our website, which is southocirwm.org. Once you get to that website, you can find the projects tab and click the drop down arrow and submit a project if you are looking to submit a project. If you want to learn about the projects that are on the current list or the completed projects that we've funded in the past through IRWM, you can click those other options below. So the Submit a Project page contains an overview of the call for projects, including links to DWR's final PSP and guidelines for Prop 1 Round 2 IRWM grant funding, as well as links to our IRWM plan. There are also resources to assist you in submitting your project, including a frequently asked questions document, as well as a Word document version of the call for project submittal form. So you can have those questions beforehand, fill it out in that Word document, and then it's essentially just copying and pasting once you're ready to submit your project. Below on that same page, you will have 3 options when selecting a project submittal form. You can either add a new project, update an existing project that is already on the list, or submit your project to the call for projects for Prop 1 Round 2 IRWM funding. The first thing you can do, I guess first we're going to run through that add a new project process. So if you have a new project, you click the start button there. The first thing you're going to be asked is to provide the project location. You can either do that by clicking on the map or entering the address or GPS coordinates in the top left corner. The next thing you'll do is you'll have to fill out your IRWM score sheet. To streamline this process, projects with stormwater or dry weather runoff capture components will also complete the Stormwater Resources Plan score sheet. And then once those are completed, you can upload those files to the submittal form by clicking the Choose File button. And then we have some naming conventions down here for you to use. Agency information is the next thing that you'll have to provide. A lot of this will be drawn from the score sheet itself. So please be sure to review this information for accuracy. Then next, you'll have to ask, or you'll be asked a few questions that are looking for high-level information for the project. You know, things like the completion date, the project status, primary goal from the IRWM plan, things like that. And once you complete that part of the form, you then hit next. If you do have the Stormwater Resources Plan score sheet that you have to fill out, the primary, secondary, and additional benefits will be, their quantity and the units will all be drawn from that score sheet. So you just have to kind of review that, make sure that it's correct, and then click next. And then finally, you'll be asked to review and submit your project. When you have when all of the pages on the left here have their blue check mark, that's how you know that you're ready to submit. A red warning sign will indicate that required information is missing and you won't be able to submit your project at that time until you address whatever issues the submittal form has. And then all successful submittals will have a submission ID. So then once projects are submitted to the list, it can take up to 1 to 2 business days to appear on the IRWM project list on our website. That's because on the back end, we do a review, make sure that everything that we have is there, or that we need is there. And then we approve the project and put it up on the list. So if you are considering submitting a new project for Prop 1 Round 2 funding, we suggest that you get your project up on the list as soon as possible and then start working on the call for projects questions. The next submittal process that we'll go through is updating an existing project that's already on the South OC IRWM project list. You do that by selecting the Update Existing button. Here, you'll be taken to a page that has the IRWM project list for you to select your project. So you can either scroll up and down on the list, or you can type in your project's name in the search bar, and that will bring your project up. Once you've done that, you'll have to confirm the project's location on the map. And if the project location hasn't changed, then you shouldn't have to make any changes here. You just hit next. So then, since this project is already on the list, we have the score sheets tied to the project on our project list. So you can download the existing score sheets for you to make any necessary changes that you need to make, since it may have been submitted some time ago. Even if no project information needs to be updated, applicants must still re-upload those score sheets so that you can then submit the project. So this will, if you don't upload your score sheets onto this page here, you will get that red warning sign, and you won't be able to submit the updated information until you provide those updated score sheets. So after score sheets have been re-uploaded, you have to follow the same process outlined before. It's making sure a lot of that high-level information is correct, because that will have been provided previously. And then once those projects are updated and that update request is submitted, it can again take 1 to 2 business days for the information, for us to review the information and then publish it on the IRWM project list. And then once that has happened, you can then view your project on the project list at that link there. Finally, we have our call for projects process. So once you've added your project to the list and it's been accepted, you've been notified that your project is now on our project list, or you've updated your project, you can then begin the call for projects process. And you do that by clicking that call for projects button there. Here again, you'll have to find your project on the South OC IRWM project list, either by searching or scrolling up or down. And then here you will get a series of questions that pertain to project eligibility regarding Prop 1. You'll be asked to provide information on things such as how the project addresses climate change. Is there a regional collaboration involved? Regional water self-reliance? Does this project assess things like water contamination? Can it be completed by the deadline? And has your organization adopted the South OC IRWM plan? So these are all necessary for eligibility. You'll also be asked to provide information on the current status of the project, including required permits and estimated dates of completion, as well as where your project is in the CEQA process, as well as a timeline for the notice of determination. And again, we kind of touched on this in the last section, but projects must complete CEQA within 18 months of award date, and we're guessing that's around February of 2025. Finally, applicants will be asked to provide community benefit information. Things like, does the project provide direct benefit to disadvantaged communities or economically distressed areas? Does the project provide benefits for Native American tribes or communities or other environmental justice considerations? If you are claiming DAC benefits with your project, you will be asked to provide, the rough proportion of the project benefits that will go directly to disadvantaged communities, as well as a map with the project's extent overlaid with DWR's DAC layers, which can be found at the link below. Finally, again, when a project's ready to be submitted to the call for project, you have to make sure that you've got blue check marks on the left side and no red warning signs, and then you will get a submission ID. And then once that's completed, you will then have to kind of wait 1 to 2 business days, and we'll assess that information, provide you with a confirmation email. And if we need anything else, any other information, we would reach out to you at that time. And then once your project has been, once you're in the call for projects, you can then view the project list at that link below. And then, as I've mentioned a few times through this presentation, we don't want to wait, or we don't want you to wait until the last minute to submit your project. Get your project on the list as soon as possible, because it does take time for us to review the project information and get it published onto the list. And that's the only way that you can submit a project for the call for projects, is if it's already on the IRWM project list. So, make sure that you're submitting as early as you can to get your project on the list. Reach out to Jenna or I if you have any questions regarding, or me directly if you have any questions regarding the submission form itself. If you have questions about eligibility or other things, we can set up a call with those who are needed. And the application window closes at 11:59 p.m. on July 1st, and no late applications will be accepted.
Just real quick, to add to that, Andy.
Mhm.
So as was included on the slides, but wasn't discussed a lot. One of the things that we've done in this round to assist with your entry process is the reason for that. There's 2 reasons for you needing to have your project on the IRWM project list. One, it's a requirement of DWR, but second, what we've done is worked with OC Survey through this online form to automate. So if adding your project first allows us to auto-populate several of the fields you would otherwise have to fill out. So for example, if you are updating an existing, we figure it's about 50 to 75% less entry than you'd have to have done previously with that automation. So that there's a really distinct reason why we have that kind of timing lapse for making sure your score sheets are you give us at least a day or 2 to make sure that those are added. And to Andy's point that he made several times, because it's auto-populated, we need to make sure that through your entry process, you are verifying those numbers, because it's pulling from your score sheet. A, we want to make sure that it's pulling correctly, but B, if you had entered something incorrectly, it's going to pull that. So just make sure that you check that before you click the submit button. Amir, did you have another question, or was your hand up from the previous question?
That's me. Can I ask a question? This is Belgium with City of San Clemente.
Yes, yes. I'm sorry. Amir had his hand up first, but I think it was from before. So I just want to make sure.
Okay. Sorry. How about the proposal attachments? Like I see attachment 1 through 4. All these attachments are, when is due for these attachments? Like attachment 1 is eligibility requirements, like resolution, and the attachment 2 is work plan. Mm-hmm. Attachment 3 is budget. Are those due by July 1st, or this could be submitted later?
That's a good question. Those are not due by July 1st. That's the application process. So the only projects that will need to fill all of that out, and that's going back to that schedule that I referenced at Flow. If your project is prioritized and goes through the process for selection, and you are part of our application, then you will have to be prepared to fill all that out. The resolution, I will note though, the resolution applies to the applicant, so that is the County of Orange. So that's on us. But for example, AB 1249 requirements for groundwater, should your project impact groundwater, that's when you have to make sure that you provide all of that background information. Or that's why we have this stormwater resource plan done early, because that is part of that stage too. You'll have to provide some environmental all your environmental documentation, at least your schedule of completion. All of that you see in those attachments is part of that after the projects are prioritized and approved by the executive committee and before February 1st in that time frame.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, take it away, Avery.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so I get to spend a few minutes here walking you all through the project ranking approach, how we rank all the projects, and it's based on the scores that your projects receive. So I'm going to provide, a pretty high level overview of how that process works, and then I'm going to spend a little bit of time actually showing you how the spreadsheets are filled out, and I'll do a brief demonstration at the end. I did want to reiterate that it's so important that you guys all get into the website and so kind of walk through the form so you're familiar with what needs to be submitted beforehand. Review this presentation that really summarizes all the information there, but it's really important to spend some time beforehand so you're not caught off guard. If you go to the next slide, the project scoring approach and ranking approach that's been developed is a pretty robust process that's been in place for quite a while, as you can see here. And the purpose of the ranking approach is to have a pretty transparent process so that everyone can understand how these projects were ranked in a very objective way. It's intended to be open and clear so that at the end of the process, everyone, all the stakeholders involved can clearly see that, yeah, these projects are the ones that rose to the top. An ad hoc committee from the IRWM region has been involved in every step of developing this process and has really led the charge there. The information that was developed back in 2013 was presented to the stakeholders and they were able to provide comments and feedback and then ultimately voted on it for inclusion into the IRWM plan. The process was also utilized during the previous Prop 1 funding round, and so it worked well during that round, and the process is really outlined pretty clearly in the IRWM plan, and I've listed the sections here. So if you want to go back and find out even additional details beyond what's included in this presentation, you can look at those sections for that. So if you go to the next slide, we have here just a overview of how the process works. The IRWM, as Jenna mentioned in the beginning, includes 4 specific goal categories. Really the pillars of what the focus of regional water quality water management is in the region here. And so we have water supply, water quality, ecosystem, and native habitat, and then the flood management. And so these are really, when we're looking at projects, we're looking at projects that provide benefits in these 4 areas. We're looking for multi-benefit projects, so they're projects that address at least 2 of these different benefit or goals. So you can submit a project that has 1, but the more goals that it addresses, it's going to score higher, and I'll kind of walk through how that scoring works in a second. But for each goal, there's 3 different components for how that you get points in a goal category. So first, you have the quantified benefit score. This is really the relative benefit of the project, so the magnitude of the benefit that's being provided by the project. We have a multi-objective score, and so each goal has different ways that the goal can be addressed, and so projects that utilize different strategies to address that goal get more points. And then the final scoring component is the ad hoc consideration score, where the ad hoc committee looks at additional factors of significance, how it addresses future planning objectives in the region, things of that are not quite as black and white, and so they consider those for part of the score as well. And then you take all those components, add the score together, and you multiply that by a weighting factor for each goal. So if you go to the next slide, we're gonna walk through each one of these scoring components here. The first one is the quantified benefit. And so as I mentioned before, for each goal, there's 100 points possible. So you can see most of the goal points come from this quantified benefit, you know, the magnitude of the benefit of the project. So how much water supply is being generated, how much area is having its water quality improved, or its natural resources improved. So you can see, you know, this component is really important. And after you submit your applications, we'll review your submittals and verify that the benefits that you're claiming are accurate. And then we create a scale for comparing the projects to one another, and it includes projects that were scored in the last 2 rounds. So we have about 20 projects already submitted that have different benefits in these categories. And so the projects that are submitted this round are not only compared to the other projects within this round, but to the projects beforehand as well. And you'll receive a proportional score based on how close you are to or where you fall within that range of projects. So if your project, you know, is providing the maximum amount of water supply that any project's provided, well, you're going to get all of the 59 points possible. And so on, you know, down if it's providing, you know, a minimal amount of water quality or water supply, it's going to provide just a percentage of that. If you go to the next slide, you can see these are the metrics that we evaluate the projects on. And so when you're submitting your projects, it's important, and I'll show you how you do this later on, but it's important that these are clearly defined and listed in your project score sheet. So each one, there's when you come back, when you get ready to submit your project, make sure you look at this slide and you put in these different metrics. And then we'll pull that off for the scoring. I'm not going to talk through each of these, so we can go on the next slide. It's just here for your reference. It's important that like I said, when you fill out your scoring sheet, that you insert that information. The second component of the goal scoring is the multiple objectives that the project will address. So again, there's a handful of strategies and objectives, and I'll show you them on the next slide, that can be utilized within each goal category, different ways to do flood management, for example. And some projects, most projects, utilize one or more of these strategies. And so it's important that you clearly describe how the objectives are being utilized, so that when we're reviewing those, it's easy for us to verify that, yes, indeed, that objective is being met and utilized. And then we can assign points appropriately for that. It's also important to note that you can't claim a strategy or an objective in a category where you actually aren't achieving any kind of quantifiable benefit. So for flood management, if you're not actually removing areas from flood hazard, you can't claim objectives in the flood management category. So if you go to the next slide, you can see here, this is pulled from the IRWM plan. I've listed it here just to make it easy for you all to reference. And they're also on the score sheets themselves. But you can see there's about 4 to 8 different objectives in each category. And it's just, again, important that you read the ones and check the ones that are most applicable to your project, that you're actually clearly going to address, and provide some documentation on the score sheet for that. If you go to the next slide, we'll look here at the final component of the goal scoring, which is just 15 percentage points possible here for this. And this is that additional ad hoc consideration. So this is when the ad hoc committee is reviewing your projects, they're going to consider things about, you know, how successful or likely is your project going to be in terms of being as successful in the grant implementation? Is it ready for, you know, is the project design complete, or is it, you know, a concept on an envelope at this point? And so, you know, all those factors get brought into play and evaluated, and we'll go into this scoring component here. Again, you're only going to be able to receive these points in the IRWM categories where you're actually providing quantified benefits. Again, going back to that example in flood management, if you're not actually, you know, addressing any area of flood management, you can't get points in this category. So if you go on to the next slide, once we have the points that you could potentially get in each goal category calculated, we then multiply those by the IRWM goal weights. These goal weights were established through that ad hoc committee process that I described in the beginning. So they are really meant to prioritize the different goals in the region based on what the region needs most. And so these have been developed again and utilized in two previous rounds of funding, and will be the same weights here for this round as well. So once you have your potential points in a goal category, it's multiplied by the weight, gives you your total score for that goal. You sum all those together, and that gives you your final project score. So here, you know, we're just showing the maximum potential points a project could get. Obviously, or maybe not obviously, but almost all projects don't address all 4 categories. As I mentioned before, a good project would address 2 or 3 of them. And so you're going to have, you know, some subset of points here. So if you go on to the next slide, once we have the points developed for each project, you can clearly see the ranking of the projects. We do also use these scores for allocating the funding potential. So we take the projects that have been selected for the slate of projects, and we figure out how many total points are there. So if you have 4 projects and they sum up to a total of, you know, 1,000 points, then we take the total money available divided by those points, and that's we then can back calculate and figure out how much funding each project will receive based on the points that they have. Again, there is kind of that minimum threshold that we've talked about, that 500,000 for implementation projects. So there is some adjustment that then takes place based on that. So there's a little bit of an iteration that goes on to get the final funding amount for the projects that have been selected. So if you go to the next slide, I just wanted to do a couple screenshots here of what the submission form looks like in case you're not familiar with it. So again, Jenna mentioned the importance of filling this form out early, getting it submitted, and then a lot of that project information gets pulled in and populated for when you actually do your final submittal. But we have an instruction tab here that shows, you know, just the basic information, kind of the steps for completing the form. The next tab, which is on the next slide, is the project information form, where you go in and you enter in the basic details about your project and the current status of it. You know, just filling out these yellow fields, you don't need to worry about any other information on the form. In fact, everything else is locked, so it should be pretty simple to fill out the form. But it's important to have a good, clear project description and a good description of how of what the project benefits are and how those were determined, helping it make it easier for us when we're seeking to verify those benefits and making sure they're really achievable with your project. If you go to the next slide, you'll see the next tab, which is the score sheet that I've discussed before. So you have some section here for just general project consideration. This is important for us to understand, you know, how ready your project is and other objectives that it kind of addresses. And then you have 4 sections below that are for each of the different goal categories. You just need to say yes for any of the objectives that your project is really going to address. And then that will calculate a score. And then on the right-hand side, this is where we plug in those metrics that I described earlier. It's really important, again, that you can put in other additional metrics as well, but it's very important that you at least put in the metrics that I had listed on the slide above so that we can compare the projects to the other against each other. And then if you go to the next slide, I've also listed, or we also have within the score sheet themselves, all the different objectives. So you can see them here, just in a table format, and how possible ways you could be addressing those objectives. So if you go to the next slide. So I'm going to share my screen real quickly here, but just wanted to include the link here again, just to make sure you all have it, because it's important to get in here and populate this early, and then the naming convention for when you actually save the file that you've created. So I'm going to share my screen. It looks like you all should be able to see it now. So I pulled an example from the previous round. This was one of the projects that went through the vetting process, the scoring process, the eligibility process, and ultimately was selected for grant funding. So you can see they have, a nice title that clearly defines kind of what the project is, the city, that's the lead agency. I removed the contact information, but then, other details about the project here, and a nice clear description of the project and the benefits, distinguishing what the main and secondary benefits are. And then on the project scoring tab, they went through and filled out all the information. You don't need to put no on these, you can leave them blank, but it's helpful that for us, to have the yeses here. It's definitely important. So this project is a dry weather capture project where they're diverting dry weather flows. So here's where they're clearly defining the metrics, that for water quality, they're capturing runoff from 402 acres, and it's eliminating 98% of the bacteria load. So that's the clear metric that we need to be able to score this project against other water quality projects. And then down here, they have water supply benefits as well. Again, you can include other metrics that the project's achieving. I think those are helpful as well. But it's important you have these ones that we need for comparing the projects. And so it captures 13 acre feet per year for water reuse. And so those are the 2 metrics that then will be pulled off for scoring or quantifying the benefits and scoring. And then we also pull in, again, the different multiple objectives that are being addressed here. So this one has 3 in the water supply category and 3 in the water quality. And so those they have different weights, so they sum up. We already have the goal weighting multiplied here, which is why this value is so high. But that's how you fill out the spreadsheet. And then Andy, if you want to start sharing again. I think that's my last slide, but yep. So I'm happy to answer any questions about the process. And
I'm not seeing any questions, any hands raised or questions in the chat. So just to reiterate, Andy, if you don't mind, do we have a next slide with the contact information? Yeah, okay. So we have about 15 minutes left, so we can open it up at this time if anyone has questions on any part of what we've presented today. To your point earlier, Amir, we certainly do encourage anyone who has really specific questions to your project that you reach out to us so that we can assist as best we can. our contact information is there. And again, I know we're a bit of a broken record on this, but if you do have questions, if you know you already have questions, I would recommend that you reach out now or very soon. I will make a plug that we as staff are, once we get near the end of the call for projects, typically get tapped with the most questions. And so our bandwidth to assist you may be limited. So I highly recommend that you do not wait until the last second to ask us all of your questions. It may also require us to work with Karen and Avery to, or even DWR to look into something really specific with disadvantaged community benefits, for example, or looking at a decision support tool eligibility. So please make sure that if you do have questions that you do not wait. So we'll just open it up, and if we don't have any questions, we can close out for the day. This will be made available, the recording will be made available, and the slides are available. And again, to Andy's earlier point, please do now, just if you have some time, go on to our website and start playing around in the form and get acquainted with the questions that you'll be asked. Any last questions? All right, going once, going twice. All right, well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Hopefully this was a really informative workshop for you. So please check out our website. All of this will be added there, the FAQ, all the document showing the questions, so you can have that as a reference guide for you. All of that will be on our website for you to reference. I look forward to a lot of projects submitted for this round. Take care.